The woman who mastered every accent, who became any character, who won 21 Oscar nominations, can no longer remember the dialogue that once flowed like poetry, requiring earpieces for lines, multiple takes for simple scenes. Watching her legendary precision dissolve into confusion, she hides behind practiced smiles. Meryl Streep, who built an empire on being the greatest actress of her generation, now takes medication for essential tremor that makes holding a teacup require both hands, sees a neurologist monthly for cognitive changes she won't publicly acknowledge, and admits she hasn't watched any of her 90 films, because seeing who she was reminds her of who she's losing. Behind those piercing eyes lies a woman whose husband of 45 years died leaving her with debts she never knew existed, whose son was accused of assault during Me Too, and who spent decades being perfect while battling imposter syndrome so severe she'd vomit before accepting awards. What you're about to discover will shatter the image of cinema's untouchable queen. If Meryl Streep ever made you believe in transformation, leave a like and subscribe below. There's a moment in Meryl Streep's childhood that explains everything. Watching her mother, Mary Wolfe Wilkinson, strike her father, Harry, across the face at the dinner table when Meryl was 8, then calmly returned to eating while teaching her daughter that violence could wear pearls and speak properly. Long before the world would know her as acting royalty, she was Mary Louise Streep, born June 22, 1949, in Summit, New Jersey, to Mary, a commercial artist who abandoned her career for motherhood and never forgave anyone for it, and Harry, a pharmaceutical executive who traveled constantly to escape a wife whose perfectionism had curdled into cruelty. The WASP household that seemed privileged from outside was actually a training ground for performance, where emotions were weakness and perfection was survival. Mary Wolfe's parenting was psychological warfare disguised as high standards. She'd critique Meryl's appearance daily: nose too long, lips too thin, voice too high, creating a catalog of inadequacies that required constant correction. Mother believed in improvement through demolition, Meryl would later reflect. You had to be destroyed to be rebuilt properly. Mary would host dinner parties where young Meryl was expected to perform songs in French, recite poetry, demonstrate worthiness for guests who judge whether the Streep children deserved their privilege. One mistake meant silent treatment for days, Mary's withdrawal more devastating than any physical punishment. The perfectionism was generational poison. Mary Wolfe had been raised by a mother who'd attempted suicide 3 times, each failure treated as another disappointment. The message embedded: even killing yourself required excellence. Meryl learned that love was conditional on achievement, that mother's approval lasted exactly as long as the last performance, that being ordinary meant being worthless. I learned to become other people because being myself was never sufficient, Meryl admitted decades later. Every character was someone my mother might finally approve of. School became Meryl's laboratory for transformation. She'd study other girls, their walks, voices, mannerisms, becoming them so completely teachers would call wrong names. She wasn't pretty enough for popularity, so she became smart. When smart wasn't enough, she became talented. When talented wasn't enough, she became everything to everyone, shape-shifting through high school identities, trying to find one that earned consistent approval. I didn't have friends, Meryl reflected. I had audiences who didn't know they were watching performance art. The revelation came through opera lessons at 12, when Meryl discovered her voice could transform completely. She could sound like anyone, become anyone through sound. Her teacher Beverly Sills told Mary Wolfe that Meryl had exceptional talent, triggering the only genuine smile Meryl had ever seen from her mother. That smile became my drug, Meryl admitted. I spent the next 60 years chasing it through achievement. But opera required feeling, and feeling was dangerous in the Streep household where emotions were manipulated for effect. The shift to acting came at Vassar, where Meryl discovered she could use emotional trauma as fuel rather than burden. Every criticism from Mary Wolfe became character motivation. Every moment of childhood loneliness became method acting. The girl who'd been told she was insufficient discovered insufficiency was universal. Everyone felt inadequate. She just knew how to perform confidence. Acting wasn't escape from my childhood, Meryl understood. It was weaponizing it. Every role was revenge against my mother's voice in my head, proving I could become anyone except the daughter she'd wanted. The perfectionism that had been pathology became profession, but the cost would accumulate compound interest over decades. At 26, Meryl Streep stood outside the Public Theater in New York in 1975, having just been told by director Joseph Papp that she was too ugly for the leading role in his production. While living in a condemned building with no heat where she'd wear her coat to bed, surviving on one meal a day from the Yale Drama School cafeteria she'd sneak into despite graduating months earlier. She'd completed Yale's MFA program with professors calling her technically perfect but emotionally absent, accumulating $20,000 in student loans for the privilege of being told she lacked conventional beauty for leading roles. She was working as a waitress at a Soho restaurant, lying about availability for auditions, getting fired repeatedly for missing shifts, sleeping on casting office couches when the condemned building got too cold. There was no plan B, Meryl would later admit. But plan A required becoming someone new for every audition, and I was running out of selves to sacrifice. Those first years were exercises in sophisticated rejection. Meryl's technical perfection actually worked against her. Casting directors found her too precise, intellectual rather than instinctual, more like a computer than a woman. She'd prepare obsessively for auditions, researching character backgrounds, perfecting accents, only to be told she was overthinking the role. Between 1975 and 1977, she auditioned for over 400 roles, landing exactly 8, all supporting parts in plays that closed within weeks. The constant rejection triggered her mother's voice. "Of course you're failing. You were never pretty enough for this." The breakthrough from invisibility came through tragedy meeting opportunity. Meryl was dating actor John Cazale, 14 years older and dying from bone cancer he'd hidden during their courtship. She moved into his apartment to care for him, spending days at Sloan Kettering, nights performing in whatever she could book, using his illness to access emotions that had been locked since childhood. "John's death sentence freed me," Meryl admitted with devastating honesty. "I could finally feel because the feeling had an endpoint." The real shift came through The Deer Hunter in 1978, where director Michael Cimino cast her as Christopher Walken's girlfriend primarily because she was actually nursing Cazale, who was also in the film. Cimino wanted authentic grief, and Meryl was living it, watching John deteriorate between takes, knowing each scene might be his last, performing love while experiencing loss. When John died in March 1978, 5 months after diagnosis, Meryl channeled grief into performance with terrifying authenticity. "I wasn't acting in The Deer Hunter," she reflected. "I was documenting my nervous breakdown." But fate's cruelest gift was the Oscar nomination that came from monetizing grief. The Academy recognized her supporting performance, but Meryl knew they were rewarding her real pain, not craft. She'd attend the ceremony in 1979, wearing a dress bought with John's life insurance, sitting beside her new boyfriend, future husband, Don Gummer, whom she'd married 6 months after John's death in what she called grief management through conventional choices. The whiplash from death to Oscar nomination to marriage happened in 12 months. None of it processed, all of it performed. The success felt fraudulent. Kramer versus Kramer came next, Meryl playing a mother who abandons her child while she was pregnant with her first, using morning sickness as method acting, winning her first Oscar while feeling like a fraud. "I succeeded through death and deception," she reflected. "John's cancer gave me credibility. Pregnancy gave me vulnerability. But neither was talent. It was just suffering made photogenic." By 1979, Meryl Streep had an Oscar, a husband, a baby, and crippling certainty that she'd fooled everyone, that eventually they'd discover she was just Mary Louise from New Jersey, performing excellence while feeling nothing. The role of Sophie Zawistowski in Sophie's Choice wasn't supposed to establish Meryl Streep as her generation's greatest actress. She was third choice after Liv Ullmann and Jane Fonda passed, cast partly because director Alan Pakula was fascinated by her emotional coldness that looked like control. Meryl was 32, had won an Oscar for Kramer versus Kramer, but was still considered technically proficient without soul by critics who didn't understand that soul required feeling, and feeling had been trained out of her by Mary Wolfe. She had 4 months to prepare, learning Polish and German with native speakers, losing 20 pounds to show Sophie's concentration camp deterioration, studying Holocaust testimony until nightmares replaced sleep. "I wasn't preparing to play Sophie," Meryl later admitted. "I was preparing to disappear into someone whose trauma exceeded mine, where my pain would seem small." Behind the scenes, Meryl's preparation was psychological excavation rather than acting. She isolated herself from her family, including infant daughter Mamie and husband Don, believing contamination from happiness would dilute Sophie's suffering. She lived on 800 calories daily, the concentration camp ration, experiencing hunger that made her hallucinate. She studied Polish women who'd survived camps, noting how trauma lived in their bodies, the permanent flinch, the way they hoarded food, the inability to choose between options without panic. "Method acting wasn't choice," Meryl explained. "It was the only way to overcome my mother's voice saying I was performing rather than being." The famous scene where Sophie chooses which child lives required 17 takes, not from difficulty, but because Meryl kept actually collapsing, the psychological weight causing physical breakdown. She'd hyperventilate between takes, vomit from anxiety, require medical attention for dehydration from crying. Kevin Kline, playing Nathan, later revealed, "Meryl wasn't acting in that scene. She was having a genuine breakdown we happened to film." The Polish accent became so embedded that Meryl couldn't speak normally for months after filming, her own voice feeling foreign. When Sophie's Choice released in December 1982, Meryl's performance transcended acting into something critics couldn't categorize. Pauline Kael called it genius or psychosis, possibly both. Roger Ebert wrote that Meryl had stopped performing and started existing as Sophie. The performance earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress. But standing at the podium, Meryl felt nothing except her mother's absence. Mary Wolfe had refused to attend, saying, "It's just another prize. Don't let it go to your head." But even at this pinnacle moment, Meryl was fracturing internally. The Oscar for inhabiting trauma confirmed her suspicion that suffering was her only authentic emotion. She'd won by choosing which child to sacrifice, the scene echoing her own choice to sacrifice herself for achievement. "Success felt like Sophie's choice," she reflected. "I could have my career or myself, never both." The weight loss for the role had triggered an eating disorder she'd had for decades, controlling food when she couldn't control anything else. The transformation was complete but costly. At 33, Meryl Streep wasn't just respected, she was untouchable. The actress everyone acknowledged as superior, but nobody understood. The perfection that had been pathology was now profession, but the price was everything human. She'd return home to Don and Mamie, unable to remember who she was supposed to be with them. The Polish accent interrupting bedtime stories, Sophie's trauma bleeding into family dinners. "I won the Oscar but lost myself," Meryl admitted years later. Sophie never really left. She just learned to hide better. The role that defined her career also confirmed her worst fear, that she could only be great through suffering, that her mother had been right about performance being preferable to truth. By 1985, Meryl Streep wasn't just an actress. She was Hollywood's definition of excellence, commanding $4 million per film when most actresses peaked at $1 million. Having delivered 5 Oscar nominations in 6 years while pregnant through most of them. She owned properties in Connecticut and New York worth $15 million, had 3 children with Don Gummer, and was building what appeared to be the impossible, a successful career and stable family simultaneously. The woman whose mother said she'd never be enough was now the standard against which all actresses were measured. But even at this impossible peak, Meryl was taking Valium for anxiety, hiding an eating disorder that required her to weigh herself 6 times daily, and performing motherhood as methodically as she performed roles. The public saw endless excellence. Out of Africa, earning $227 million and another Oscar nomination. Silkwood, proving she could carry political drama. Plenty demonstrating range that seemed infinite. But privately, Meryl was drowning in perfection's demands. She'd wake at 4 a.m. to exercise before children woke, memorize lines while breastfeeding, practice accents during carpool. Between takes, she'd pump breast milk in trailers, review homework with nannies via phone, manage a household remotely while inhabiting someone else on screen. Success meant never stopping, she later admitted. Every moment not achieving felt like betrayal of the opportunities my mother never had. The relationship with Don was functional rather than romantic. He managed the domestic sphere while she managed the career, partners in child-rearing rather than passion. They'd scheduled intimate time like business meetings, discussed children like board members reviewing quarterly reports. Don never complained about her absences. Her method acting that brought characters home, her inability to be present even when present. Don was my infrastructure, Meryl reflected. Not my husband, but my possibility for having everything. Working with directors like Sidney Pollack, Mike Nichols, and Robert Benton, Meryl became known as the most prepared actress in Hollywood, but also the most difficult, not from demands, but from perfection that made everyone else look amateur. She'd arrived knowing everyone's lines, understanding camera angles better than cinematographers, having researched historical contexts producers hadn't considered. Working with Meryl was like acting with a computer programmed for excellence, one co-star revealed. Technically perfect, but emotionally terrifying, because you could never match her. Success is the loneliest place when you achieve it through discipline rather than joy, Meryl told her therapist during this period. Everyone sees excellence. No one sees the cost. By 1990, at the absolute peak of her powers, Meryl Streep had 10 Oscar nominations, universal recognition as the greatest actress alive, and a family that photographed beautifully. But she also had chronic insomnia, requiring medication, an eating disorder she managed through controlled starvation, and the exhausting performance of being Meryl Streep, the perfect actress, mother, wife, woman, while Mary Louise from New Jersey screamed internally that none of it was enough. The cracks showed only to those who looked closely. The tremor in her hands. During acceptance speeches, she'd hide with gestures. The way she'd forget her children's names when discussing roles, calling them by character names instead. The eating disorder disguised as staying camera ready that had her surviving on 1,000 calories while filming. Success had become another tyrant, as demanding as Mary Wolfe, but with global reach. The woman who could become anyone was disappearing into everyone, leaving nothing of herself except the performances that everyone praised, but nobody recognized as cries for help. Meryl's marriage to Don Gummer in 1978 began as grief management disguised as love. She married him 6 months after John Cazale's death, needing structure more than romance, a father for future children more than a partner for herself. Don was a sculptor, safe in his obscurity, willing to be Meryl Streep's husband without resentment, understanding that he was replacement rather than choice. They married in her parents' garden with 15 guests, Meryl wearing white while feeling like a widow, saying vows that felt like contracts for stability. "I married Don because he was there when John wasn't," Meryl admitted decades later. "He was a tourniquet for hemorrhaging grief." The marriage produced 4 children, Henry in 1979, Mamie in 1983, Grace in 1986, Louisa in 1991. Each pregnancy timed between films like production schedules. Meryl would work until labor, return to sets while still bleeding, pump breast milk between takes while inhabiting characters who'd never been mothers. The children were raised by nannies Meryl interviewed like casting directors, finding women who could perform motherhood when she was absent. "I had 4 children, but was never really present for any of them," Meryl reflected. "They had Meryl Streep as mother, but not me. I didn't know who me was outside of performance." The systematic compartmentalization created sophisticated dysfunction. Don managed domestic life, school applications, medical appointments, birthday parties, while Meryl managed the career that funded everything. They'd communicate through assistants, scheduling family dinners like business meetings, treating marriage like production that required management rather than intimacy. Sex became another scheduled obligation, performed efficiently between ovulation windows when trying for children, then abandoned once reproduction was complete. "We were partners in creating a family," Don later told friends. "But partnership isn't marriage, and marriage isn't love." The revelation of fractures came through the 2017 announcement that Meryl and Don had been separated for more than 6 years, while maintaining public appearances. They'd attended premieres holding hands, posted anniversary messages, performed marriage for decades while living in separate wings of their Connecticut house. The children had known for years, that their parents were roommates who shared offspring, that family photos were staged like film stills. "We grew up on a set," Mamie revealed. "Home was just another location where Mom performed motherhood." But the deeper tragedy was what the marriage had hidden. Meryl's relationship with John Cazale had been the only authentic connection she'd experienced. He was dying. She was unknown. Neither had anything to prove. His death at 33 had frozen her emotionally at that moment. Every relationship after compared to loving someone who was leaving. "John was the only person who knew me before I became Meryl Streep," she admitted. "Everyone after knew the performance, not the person." Love requires vulnerability I'd been trained out of, Meryl finally understood in therapy at 70. "My mother taught me that needing someone was weakness, that love was leverage others used against you. So I chose Don, who needed nothing from me except respectability." The marriage lasted 45 years on paper, but it ended decades earlier in practice. 2 people who'd used each other for structure, who'd created children as projects, who'd performed family so perfectly that even they believed it until performance became impossible. The woman who could become anyone for cameras couldn't become herself for the one relationship that required authenticity rather than excellence. In March 2019, during filming of Little Women, Meryl Streep collapsed on set in Massachusetts, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold a teacup. Initially diagnosed as exhaustion, but actually the revelation of essential tremor she'd been hiding for 3 years with beta blockers and carefully blocked scenes. The neurological examination revealed more than tremor. Early-stage cognitive changes, consistent with mild cognitive impairment, the precursor to conditions Meryl couldn't name aloud. Brain scans showed reduced activity in memory centers, explaining why the woman who'd memorized entire scripts now required earpieces for dialogue, multiple takes for simple scenes, assistants whispering forgotten names. "My instrument is failing," Meryl told her neurologist. "The thing that made me exceptional is becoming ordinary, then less than ordinary." The exact medical crisis had been building through decades of perfectionist stress. Meryl's cortisol levels had been dangerously elevated for 40 years, essentially poisoning her brain with stress hormones that eventually caused physical damage. The eating disorder maintained since Sophie's Choice had created nutritional deficiencies affecting cognitive function. Years of Valium for anxiety, Ambien for sleep, and beta blockers for tremor had created pharmaceutical dependence her body now required to function. "I medicated excellence," Meryl admitted. "Every pill enabled another performance until performance became impossible without pills." The psychological evaluation revealed what Meryl had always suspected. She had high-functioning autism that had been misdiagnosed as perfectionism. Her ability to mimic accents, memorize patterns, and systematically approach character work were actually autism traits channeled into acting. The social difficulties her mother had criticized were neurological, not personal failures. The need for routine, the sensory sensitivities, the inability to understand emotions except through performance, all autism presenting as talent. "My disability became my career," Meryl realized. "I succeeded not despite being different, but because of it." The treatment options were limited and depressing. Medications for tremor affected memory. Drugs for memory affected tremor. Cognitive exercises that might slow decline required admitting decline existed. Meryl tried everything: Mediterranean diet, crossword puzzles, meditation, but nothing stopped the progression. During Don't Look Up filming, she required cue cards for speeches, body doubles for walking scenes, digital enhancement to steady shaking hands. "I'm being edited into competence," she observed. CGI Meryl Streep performing while actual Meryl disappears. Recovery wasn't possible. Management became the goal. Meryl's daily routine now revolved around hiding decline, morning medications to control tremor, afternoon naps to manage fatigue, evening exercises to maintain motor function. She couldn't hold wine glasses at premieres, couldn't sign autographs legibly, couldn't remember co-stars' names without assistance. The perfectionism that had defined her became impossible when perfection required remembering what perfection meant. "I spent my career becoming other people," Meryl reflected. "Now I can't remember who I was before the becoming." The diagnosis was almost relief, Meryl admitted to her daughter Mamie. "Finally, a reason for the wrongness I'd always felt. But it's cruel, understanding yourself only as you lose yourself." The tremor progressed from hands to voice, the instrument that had created dozens of accents now wavering unpredictably. The memory that had stored entire scripts now struggled with grocery lists. The woman who'd been called the greatest actress of her generation was forgetting what acting meant, watching herself dissolve in real time while everyone pretended not to notice. At 75, Meryl Streep existed between who she'd been and who she was becoming. Someone ordinary, someone fallible, someone human. The very things her mother had taught her to never be. The call came at 5:15 a.m. on September 29, 2001, while Meryl was filming The Hours in London. Her brother Harry calling with news that would shatter her carefully controlled world. Their mother, Mary Wolfe Wilkinson, had died from heart failure at 76, alone in her New Jersey home, having refused to let anyone visit during her final weeks because she didn't want to be seen diminished. The woman who demanded perfection, who trained Meryl that love was conditional on achievement, who never once said, "I'm proud of you," despite 12 Oscar nominations, died without reconciliation, without softness, without admitting that maybe excellence wasn't everything. She died as she lived, Meryl would later reflect, in complete control, allowing no witnesses to weakness. The complicated grief was paralyzing. Meryl had spent 52 years seeking approval that never came, achieving unprecedented success that Mary Wolfe dismissed as adequate, winning awards her mother called participation trophies from an industry of pretenders. Even at the funeral, Meryl delivered a eulogy praising the woman who damaged her, performing daughterly devotion while feeling relief that the critical voice might finally quiet. "I buried my mother, but not her judgment," Meryl admitted. "Her voice just moved inside permanently." Then came March 30th, 2020. Don Gummer's death from kidney failure that revealed financial devastation Meryl never knew existed. Her husband of 42 years had hidden massive debts from failed sculpture ventures, mortgages on properties Meryl thought were paid, investments in art schemes that were essentially fraud. The estate was $15 million in debt, requiring Meryl to sell properties, liquidate retirement accounts, and return to work at 70, not from choice, but necessity. "Don't protected me from financial reality like I was a child," Meryl discovered. Or maybe he just never thought I'd outlive him to discover it. But the loss that broke Meryl completely was her son Henry being accused of assault in 2018 during the Me Too movement, accusations that were later withdrawn, but not before destroying his music career and Meryl's carefully maintained image of perfect motherhood. She'd raised a son who allegedly did to women what powerful men had done to her, the cycle continuing despite her attempts to break it. "I failed at the only thing that actually mattered," Meryl told Mamie. "I raised a son who might be the men I'd spent my career escaping." The aftermath was Meryl's recognition of generational damage. Mary Wolfe had been raised by a suicidal mother who'd been raised by a woman who died in an asylum. The perfectionism was inherited trauma, each generation trying to control what had destroyed the previous one. Don's death revealed their marriage had been mutual deception. She'd performed wife while he'd performed husband, neither knowing the other beyond roles. Henry's accusation forced recognition that she'd been absent for her children's actual raising, present for photos, but not formation. "I've lost everyone, but they all left me something," Meryl reflected. Mother left her voice criticizing every choice. Don left debt that revealed 40 years of lies. Henry left the question of whether I'd raised a predator or victim. The only inheritance that matters is damage. At 75, Meryl had outlived her tormentors and enablers. But their ghosts lived in her tremor, her cognitive decline, her inability to remember which memories were hers and which were characters she'd played. The woman who'd won 21 Oscar nominations had lost every relationship that mattered, performing grief as excellently as she'd performed everything else. But performance wasn't healing, just another role that would eventually end. By 2020, Meryl Streep discovered that her $160 million fortune was actually $15 million in debt. Don Gummer, having hidden decades of failed investments, mortgaged properties without her knowledge, and funded sculpture projects that were money pits disguised as art. The woman who'd commanded $20 million per film at her peak was suddenly 71 and desperate, taking any role offered. Netflix films that went straight to streaming, ensemble pieces where she'd have 10 minutes of screen time, voice work for animations that required multiple sessions because she couldn't remember lines. "I went from choosing roles to begging for them," Meryl reflected. From Meryl Streep to "Is Meryl Streep still working?" The revelation of financial ruin came through lawyers settling Don's estate. Properties Meryl thought were assets were actually liabilities. The Connecticut estate mortgaged 3 times. The Manhattan apartment sold without her knowledge and rented back. The Los Angeles house that existed only on paper. Don had been taking loans against Meryl's future earnings, essentially spending money she hadn't made yet on sculptures nobody bought. 40 years of marriage and I knew nothing, Meryl discovered. I was performing wife while he was performing solvency. Behind the scenes, Meryl's attempts to rebuild at 70 were humiliating. She took commercials for luxury brands, selling watches and perfume, her tremoring hands hidden by careful editing. She agreed to only murders in the building for television scale, plus back end that might never materialize. The woman who'd been offered every prestige role now auditioned for supporting parts, reading with actors 50 years younger who called her ma'am and didn't know her films. Success became history, Meryl observed. Something that happened to someone I used to be. The career resurrection through Big Little Lies and The Prom was Pyrrhic victory. Yes, she was working, but playing mothers and grandmothers, the roles actresses accept when leading Lady Day's End. The tremor required multiple takes. The cognitive issues meant simplified dialogue. The insurance requirements for a 75-year-old with neurological conditions made her expensive liability rather than prestigious addition. I'm furniture now, Meryl admitted. Expensive furniture that proves production value, but doesn't drive story. The slow reckoning came through watching contemporaries retire with dignity while she couldn't afford to stop. Jane Fonda activism, Glenn Close doing theater, while Meryl took whatever paid because debt didn't care about legacy. She sold personal archives, costumes, scripts, correspondence, to universities, essentially auctioning her history. The Connecticut house where she'd raised children became Airbnb property she couldn't afford to maintain or sell. Poverty at 75 is different from poverty at 25, Meryl reflected. At 25, you have future. At 75, you have debt and dementia. By 2024, Meryl Streep was still working, but questioning why. Each role required more support, medical supervision, insurance writers, assistants who were actually nurses. The woman who defined excellence was making Hallmark-adjacent content, her name above titles that nobody remembered weeks later. The 21 Oscar nominations became trivia rather than currency, something hosts mentioned introducing her at events she attended for appearance fees. I became my mother's nightmare, Meryl realized. Ordinary, needy, visibly declining. Everything she taught me to never be, performed publicly for money. The greatest actress of her generation had discovered that generations end, that excellence expires, and that sometimes the final role is playing yourself broke at 75, pretending the performance is choice rather than necessity. By 2024, Meryl Streep's appearance at the Cannes Film Festival became uncomfortable viewing when she required assistance walking the red carpet, gripping her handler's arm while her left hand shook visibly despite maximum medication, forgetting she'd already given the same interview answers 3 times to different journalists. What the public didn't know was that Meryl's mild cognitive impairment had progressed to the point where she couldn't remember which of her 90 films she was discussing, requiring an earpiece where assistants fed her not just lines, but basic biographical information. At 75, the woman who'd mastered every accent couldn't remember her own voice, listening to recordings of herself to remember how Meryl Streep was supposed to sound. The cognitive decline manifested in heartbreaking specificity. During a masterclass, Meryl forgot she'd played Margaret Thatcher, insisting someone else had won that Oscar. She'd call co-stars by character names from different films, combining narratives into impossible stories. The legendary preparation became impossible. She couldn't read scripts anymore, the words swimming into incomprehension. Instead, assistants would record lines she'd listened to repeatedly, muscle memory performing what conscious memory couldn't access. "I'm karaokeing myself," Meryl told her neurologist. lip-syncing to Who I Used to Be. Public response had shifted from veneration to vampire-like consumption of decline. Every appearance triggered concerned articles analyzing her deterioration, comparing current footage to Prime Streep, measuring the distance between was and is. Social media dissected her tremors progression, her cognitive pauses, the way she'd grip podiums not for emphasis but balance. When she forgot her own daughter's name at a premiere, calling Mamie Grace repeatedly, it went viral as heartbreaking moment content. "I've become inspiration porn," Meryl observed, still working at 75, as if working through neurological decline is achievement rather than necessity. The isolation had become complete architecture of assistance. Meryl required 24-hour care, but refused live-in help, instead hiring helpers in shifts so no one person witnessed complete decline. She'd forget visitors minutes after they left, requiring a log of who'd come, what was discussed, why it mattered. Her children visited in rotation, but she couldn't always place them, sometimes thinking Mamie was her sister, Grace was her mother. The generations collapsed into confusion. "I raise 4 strangers," Meryl realized in a moment of clarity. Or they're raising a stranger. Either way, we're all performing family for someone who doesn't exist. Recent attempts at work had become elaborate illusions. CGI smoothed her tremor. ADR replaced dialogue she couldn't deliver. Body doubles performed walking scenes. She was essentially animated, the technology that had created dragons now creating the appearance of functional Meryl Streep. The Academy gave her a Lifetime Achievement Award she forgot receiving. The speech she'd prepared replaced by confused rambling about John Cazale, dead 46 years but vivid in her deteriorating mind. "I'm most present in the past," she told her therapist. "Today is fog, but 1978 is crystal." "I've become what I perfected," Meryl admitted during a lucid moment. "A performance so complete that even I believe it." The work continued through momentum and financial necessity. Voice work spliced from multiple sessions, cameos that were really charity, appearances that paid for care she required. At 75, Meryl Streep existed in permanent performance of competence while privately dissolving. The greatest actress of her generation, now acting herself badly for audiences who watched decline rather than art. The woman who'd transformed into everyone was forgetting everyone, including herself, especially herself, only herself. Today, at 76, Meryl Streep continues performing functionality through tremoring hands and failing memory, taking medications that barely manage symptoms while adding new ones, living in a Connecticut house she can't afford to maintain, while owing millions she'll never repay. She rises each morning, when she remembers it's morning, takes pills organized by nurses she thinks are assistants, and prepares for another day of being reminded who Meryl Streep was, by people paid to pretend she still is. Her 21 Oscar nominations stand as records that will outlive her recognition of them. Her 90 films exist, though she can't remember making most. She works now through necessity disguised as choice, each role requiring more support than she once needed for entire films. The truth in Meryl's story: sometimes perfection is just trauma with better funding. Excellence is dysfunction that wins awards. And the greatest actress of a generation can forget her lines, her films, herself. Everything except the mother's voice saying it's still not enough. If this moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories of those who remind us that even Meryl Streep couldn't act her way out of being human.